Today's question and questions around this subject are extremely common. This comes from Quentin Dolworth, one of my patrons. He wants to know, what are the procedural differences between tanning with the fur on and tanning hides with the fur off? The whole subject of tanning hides with the hair on is just a lot to unpack. You know, there's no way, as it is, the information I'm going to give you today, which is kind of foundational information, is a lot for a video this size, and it's going to run longer than I actually, would usually plan on making these type of videos. I'm not going to do like a procedural video, this is how you tan a hide. The other problem with that is, like, I don't know what hide you have. If you have a bear hide versus a rabbit hide, or a coyote hide, or a skunk hide, or a beaver, these are all very different and they can require different important things. So tanning in general is not really this kind of like super simple paint by numbers process. You say, do this, do this, do that. There's tools and there's techniques. When I will do a procedural video on tanning with the hair on, I don't know. Most of my videos on YouTube are tanning with the hair off. I actually recommend that you learn by tanning with the hair off first. It's in many ways easier. But what I'm going to do today is lay some really important foundational information. Now, trust me when I say that this is information that anyone who wants to tan hides with the hair on should know. And then you can take that, absorb it, go out into the world, look at the books, the YouTube videos, and kind of use that as a foundation as you interpret and apply that information. Now, the main problem with tanning hides with the fur on is keeping the fur in the skin. Once an animal dies, bacteria that are just everywhere, right? Bacteria are everywhere, but suddenly there's no defenses and they can start to attack the body. One of the things they attack first is the hair follicles, okay? So the hair's here in the skin, embedded in these follicles down here at the root. It's held in place in the skin so it doesn't fall out. Right away, bacteria can start attacking this down here, loosen it up, and then the hair falls out. Now, if you're tanning with the hair off, you want to remove the hair, and there's actually processes you would go through to remove that, like including lime or soaking in wood ashes, and one of those methods is actually called sweating, and all it is a controlled version of this, where fresh hides are laid out, usually in a stack, sometimes in like a warm, humid room, and the hair, roots are attacked by bacteria, and then they just slip out, and then you tan the hide. But obviously, if you want to keep the hair in, this is a major problem. Now, this process can actually happen very fast. Let's say a fox gets hit on the road, and you're driving by and you're like, hey, there's a fox that was hit on the road. Looks perfectly good to me. I'll take it home, skin it, and tan it. Well, if it's a hot, sunny day and you throw it in the trunk of your car and then you go to town and get groceries and visit with some friends and stop and go to the swimming hole on the way home, etc., under warm conditions, the hair could be slipping in less than a day. Like by the end of the day, in certain parts of the hide, the hair could be slipping. So procrastination is your enemy. Now, there's several things you can do to halt that process and preserve the hide until you tan it. Now, remember, these three things I'm going to tell you right now they're not anything to do with tanning the hide. They're just to preserve the hide until you tan it. Those are freezing, salting, and drying. Freezing is self-explanatory. You water it up, put it in a bag, stick it in the freezer. It's so cold, the bacteria can't grow, everything's halted, you're good until you can get around to tanning it. Now, drying does the same thing, but by stopping bacterial action because the bacteria need water to work, right? So once they're completely dried out, they're either completely dead or they go into a dormant state, like a cystic state, where they're in limbo until moisture comes and then they come back to life and go back to work. But if the hide is completely dried, there should be none of that bacterial action and the hair should stay in place. Drying the skin can also help in retaining the hair as you tan the hide. So it's not a bad idea to, at some point in the process, dry the skin out. Now, it's important to remember that if there's a lot of fat and flesh, especially fat on the skin, this can cause a major problem when you dry it. There's something called grease burn. Grease burn ruins a lot of hides. If there's any fat on the skin, if the fat is raw and it liquefies and soaks into the skin as it dries, it completely ruins the skin. Like, it'll just fall to pieces if you even touch it. You could just poke your finger right through it. I'll cut in a picture here of a grease burned sheep hide just to demonstrate what that's like. So if you're going to dry it, you want to get all the fat off of the skin by flushing. Okay, so the third option is salting, and salting halts bacterial action by essentially killing the bacteria by just kind of sucking it dry by just having an extremely high salt environment. There's some bacteria that can live with salt, but they're not really harmful. They're called halophiles. That's probably too nerdy for this video, but long story short, salt halts the bacterial action, preserves, this process from happening, and you're all good. Now, when you're salting, it's important to get most of the moisture out. So when you salt the skin, you just kind of rub just regular salt on the flesh side of the skin. It will actually pull moisture because salt is hygroscopic, so it attracts moisture, and it'll pull moisture out of the skin, and the skin will like drip actually and get to kind of like a leathery state. So if you're going to store it with any dampness like that and not dry it, then you want it in that damp kind of but leathery state where more than half the water has left the skin, and then you can kind of roll it up and store it for a while. Even so, I wouldn't store it like that for too long if you're wanting to tan with the hair in. But it will stop or greatly slow the bacterial action, and you should be good for a while. If the skin is salted and dried out, then it's pretty much like as if it were dried, except for one thing. If you have a very high humidity environment, like one time I was living in North Carolina, very different than where I live here, where it's dry in the summer, there's not very much air humidity. Found this boat-killed beaver that got hit in the head by a speedboat. Skinned it, salted it because I didn't know what I was doing, stretched it out, dried it, hung it up, and it would just attract moisture out of the air and just drip all the time because the salt, again, is hygroscopic. Now, again, none of these have to do with tanning the skin. Some tanning processes do use salt, but it's not essential in most tanning processes. So again, just remember, this is just saving the skin until you can tan it. So there are two substances I know that will fix the hair and the skin, kind of like lock it in place. Those are alum, which is an aluminum salt, and tannic acid, which occurs widely in the plant kingdom. It's in oak bark, pine bark, fir bark, hemlock bark, spruce bark, all kinds of roots and pods and stuff like that. I have a video on that, which I will link right here. Tanning materials that contain a lot of tannic acid. Anyway, both of these substances will kind of like shrink the skin and lock the hair in place. Alum is an aluminum salt. It does occur naturally and has been used for tanning since at least, there's records at least going back to Egyptian times. I'm sure it was used before that. It's not a common mineral, so it's not like you're going to walk out and just find it laying around unless you know where to look, but it is natural. Was used. There's two forms. I don't remember what the other one is, but one's aluminum sulfate. Anyway, you can buy like a manufactured form of this and use it. Usually it's mixed with salt and water. The hide's dunked in that. It can stay in there for a while because the salt preserves it. And this like shrinks and locks the skin up and locks the hair in place. So two places you might run into alum in daily life are in pickling, when you buy a jar of pickles or if you're making pickles, and in antiperspirant. So you can buy alum in very small quantities. If you're tanning, don't buy these little tiny quantities in the spice aisle, but you can get it in the spice aisle of most grocery stores. You put a small amount in your pickles and it firms up the flesh of the pickle. Like if you put a little bit of alum on your tongue, it would just make your tongue instantly kind of like pucker up and feel extremely dry. So it's probably not advisable to put aluminum salts in your food like that, but it's very common and you'll see it on the labels of pickles in the store. The other place is in antiperspirant. So you put it on your armpits and it just kind of shocks the proteins and shrinks your skin up and prevents you from sweating, which if you think about it is pretty disgusting, but people do that all the time. So it's often found in antiperspirants. And that's exactly what it does to the skin. It's also a sort of a tanning agent of sorts, and it kind of like makes the skin tanned feeling. Usually that's combined with some oils and stuff, and the skin has to be worked, and that's a different story. If you want to know about that, look up alum tanning, which is also traditionally known as tawing, T-A-W-I-N-G. So tannic acid will do the same thing. The problem with tannic acid is that it also contains coloring matters. And some are more coloring than others, but typically they'll be kind of a reddish or brownish type of hue. I have an example here I can show you. So here's a squirrel hide that was tanned in tannic acid, and one that was probably, I don't know, but it was probably just tanned with brains or egg yolks. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see this one has this kind of dingy look where all the white hairs on the belly are stained with this sort of pinkish off color, like that just doesn't look the same, and honestly it just doesn't look very good. So that's probably why, even though tannic acid will set the hair in the skin, it will tan the skin, it's easier, that it wasn't traditionally used very much. Most skins with the fur on, like what we call fur skins, for fur coats and stuff like that, were either alum tanned or they were just dressed. So dressing just means that you saturate the skin, and that's probably, I don't know for sure, but that's probably how this was tanned. You saturate the skin fiber, meaning the fibers inside here in the body of the skin, which is made up essentially of fibers like, it's like felt or something, with fatty acids and oils. Usually it's going to be brains or egg yolks or either one of those mixed with a little bit of oil. And then the skin is simply softened by manipulating it manually. Just kind of like work the skins and soften them as they dried. Now, I've often wanted to experiment, but just, there's only so many hours in the day, with different ways to use tannic acid on furs without getting this effect. A couple ideas are as follows. So one is you might be able to dip it for a very short time, especially if you use a tannic acid material that isn't as offensive in some way. Like some of them are just a much lighter color, like they might be a very light tan color or something like that, instead of this sort of pinkish or red or brown. Dip it for a brief time, just long enough to, again, kind of like attack those skin fibers and shrink them up without a lot of time for it to dye the skin. Another one is, I have a book called The Secrets of Eskimo Skin Sewing. I'm pretty sure it was in that book where they had a process where they used ground alder bark for the tannic acid and applied it to the flesh side of the skin, just kind of like wet, ground up, I think, and then probably powdered, and then folded the skin up like this, roll it up, set it aside for a while, and let that tannin kind of soak in. Now, the problem with that is if the skin is damp and wet, this process is continuing. And you need to remember that anytime you're tanning a fur, unless the skin has already been locked in place with alum or tannic acid or something similar, this process is still occurring. So if I take a squirrel skin and I saturate it in say like an egg yolk solution with a little bit of oil, which is called fat liquoring, I get those fibers lubed up really good. Well, now my hair's wet and the skin is wet, and I'm sitting there working it and softening it, and this process is going on. Will it be softened and dried and finished before this reaches its logical, end and the hair starts to fall out? Well, who knows? But you need to remember that whenever you're tanning a fur, this is a potential problem. And if I were to apply it just to the flesh side, it would take a long time for that liquor to penetrate far enough to get to these hair roots to do this locking in. So on a thicker skin, like say even a squirrel, but let's say this raccoon, which has some very thick parts, that probably isn't going to get through the skin in time to kind of lock those hairs in place before they start slipping out. On a thinner skin, let's say this coyote, which is fairly thin, lots of other skins, skunk comes to mind for some reason. It may work. I mean, it may get through the skin in time to do that. You could also leave it for a short time, but I'm just saying that I'm not sure that it would penetrate fast enough to get to the hair roots and lock them in place. Also remember, this is the secret of Eskimo skin sewing. So we're talking about, even in the summer, very cool climate where these processes don't happen as fast. So, tucked away on the floor of a cool structure, it's going to take a lot longer for this slippage to occur. Okay, so one last thing is, at some point, even if the skin is fresh and you get it off the animal and you flush it, you could proceed with tanning by just applying things to this side, like say again, like brains or egg yolks, brain tanning or egg yolk tanning, and then work the skin. But usually at some point you're going to end up drying the skin. You can re-soak it from the flesh side by just putting like wet towels or wet moss or something like that on here, and that really will help with retaining the hair because you're not soaking the whole skin. Now there's two problems with soaking the skin. One is that you're going to get the whole skin through and through extremely wet, whereas if you, wet it from the flesh side slowly over time with these like wet towels and stuff, it's not going to get quite as wet. Also, the hair will get wet if you dip it. Like if you wash it, you might want to shampoo it. Like this is a coyote hide. Coyotes just smell bad. They smell like dogs. It's hard to wash out. You might want to shampoo the hair at some point, right? So then the hair is going to be wet, and that's really hard to dry. So while you're tanning a fur, typically you want to like really fluff this up, get a comb if you have it, comb the fur out, like get air on it. You can use a blow dryer on the cool setting with no heat. You can have a fan, just work in the wind, maybe set it in the sun for a minute and then come back and comb it again and try to get that hair dry as fast as possible. So there's some things you need to know about tanning with the fur on. Basically, if you have a fur skin, or if you run across an animal, you know, your uncle shoots a bobcat in the chicken coop, or you find a fox killed on the road, or whatever happens, you want to get that thing skinned and either salted, frozen, or dried right away, or start tanning it right away if you know what you're doing, or you put it into alum or tannin right away. Whatever you do, don't procrastinate, because hair slippage is a real problem. If you want to know about fleshing hides, which is important and it's a real skill, look at trapper videos. There's a lot of great trappers on YouTube who have way more experience fleshing furs than I do. These guys are real, expert at that, and there's a lot of good videos on that. Coon Creek Outdoors is a great channel to check out. So if you're interested in tanning in general, I have 2 playlists for you. This one is kind of a general playlist with stuff like fleshing and tools and things like that. This one follows the tanning of deer hide from start to finish in oak bark. Pretty cool stuff. Check it out. Good luck with those tanning projects. I'll see you later.